Basically, Cohen's fifth thesis from his article states that the monster prevents mobility of many sorts. In his article, Cohen states that the monster itself makes sure that curiosity is more often punished than rewarded. One is better off safely contained in one's own domestic sphere than abroad, away from the watchful eyes of the state. The monster prevents mobility. So we can take the cultural moment in England at the time that Dracula was written, and we can see that there are many English fears over intellectual deviation, new ideas that are threatening to some, welcomed by others. Pat, if you could read the quote from page 51 in Dracula.
And here we see Dracula acting as the monster, and he says, Harker, you may go anywhere you wish in the castle, except where the doors are locked, where of course you will not wish to go.
So Dracula, as our monster in the book, represents threatening and ominous monstrosity, obviously. By warning Harker of the locked doors, if we take locked doors as a representation of the intellectual unknown, Dracula is essentially making that which is intellectually unknown into something threatening, something that is undesirable. Harker's mobility, intellectually, and in the book physically, is met with danger and monstrous nightmares. Also, since Dracula, in the same passage, warns Harker of where he sleeps, if we see sleep as a representation of the unconsciousness, then that is also being controlled by Dracula and by the monster. Right? That's
oh, nailed it. Nope, too far.
Whoop, whoop. All right.
Geographical limitations. So in Cohen's argument, he says the monster limits three things: geographically, intellectually, and sexually. And read the quote about the geographical limitation.
When speaking about the monster's geographical limitation, Cohen describes how, back in the day, medieval merchants intentionally disseminated maps depicting sea serpents at the edges of their trade routes in order to discourage further exploration.
So here in Dracula, you can see Stoker's representation of this fear of like the unknown, this fear of like your limited place, and he states that the keen wind still carried the howling of the dogs, though this grew fainter as we went on our way. The baying of the wolves sounded nearer and nearer, as though they were closing round us from every side. I grew dreadfully afraid. So this is Harker endeavoring into this new place in Transylvania, into the unknown, and it kind of shows the English fears of the time of like xenophobia. They're afraid of Western European influence and culture. So this is portraying this fear that was throughout England at the time. And also in 52, Dracula states, we are in Transylvania, and Transylvania is not England. Our ways are not your ways. Shall be to you many strange things. Again, this is kind of restating the differences between the English culture and all other cultures at the time. This like deviation in cultures presents fear to the English normality of life.
In the same way that the map makers place sea monsters at the borders, Stoker's placed Dracula at the edge of the European borders to scare off exploration. So the other way the monster polices borders is that of sexual borders. In his article, Cohen states that the monster enforces the cultural codes that regulate sexual desire. Pat, if you could read the quote on page 70.
On page 70, you have, I could feel the soft, shivering touch of the lips on the supersensitive skin of my throat, and the hard dents of two sharp teeth just touching and pausing there. I closed my eyes in languorous ecstasy and waited with beating heart. And of course, this is the scene where Harker encounters the three vampire ladies.
So by relating this terrifying vampiric attack to a sexual encounter, and the cultural moment itself is discouraging, sexual curiosity, is essentially policing the borders as the monster does. And then on 250, we also see Pat.
On 250, this is where Van Helsing steps in with the cross, and he states, "This is when Lucy is enticing Arthur. Come to me, Arthur. Leave these others and come to me. My arms are hungry for you. Come and we can rest together." Then she was leaping for him when Van Helsing sprang forward and held between them his little golden crucifix.
So at this point, Lucy is now a vampire. She is now the monster herself. By trying to entice her victims with sexual favors, she essentially turns kiss or any sexual encounter itself into a curse or any threatening encounter. She stifles sexual desire and curiosity by relating it to her monstrous being, and Van Helsing's crucifix represents the border itself, which is, in this case, purity and chastity.
Okay, so Cohen also argued that the monster can kind of limit or border social progression with the feminist movement. Read the quote that he used.
Cohen describes in his article how in the Salem witch trials, the old women of Salem hanging died because they crossed a different border, one that prohibited women from managing property and living solitary, unmanaged lives.
Okay, so as we have discussed, Mina is like the ideal like new woman of the time. Like the cultural moment was the new women, like the progression of women into society. And you see here on 220, Van Helsing refers to her as that clever woman who can also read and write shorthand, so that kind of implies that, in a sense, she knows more than the man. And then as we, like, tracked her, I guess, her emotional deterioration, the men kind of act as a monster and, like, the response of society to this feminist movement. As, like, on page 274, they say that it has no part for women in it. So that's, again, the men are kind of the monsters policing the borders between the possible and the impossible, stating that women aren't able to progress into this new movement.
In the book, Mina, the new woman, is eventually turned into the vampire, the monster itself. It's kind of a cautionary tale as to what may happen to new women in society. So finally, the monstrous transgression that happens in Dracula and in the case of all monsters is what Cohen describes in his article when he says that the monster is transgressive, too sexual, perversely erotic, and so the monster and all that it embodies must be exiled and destroyed. We see a similar sentiment for monsters in Dracula on page
260. On 328, you see Dracula as being that too erotic and too sexual. When he pulled open his shirt and with his long sharp teeth opened a vein in his breast. When the blood began to spurt out, he took my hands in one of his, holding them tight, and with the other seized my neck and pressed my mouth to the wound, so that I must either suffocate or swallow.
So now he's definitely too sexual and perversely erotic, and on page 256.
The men gather and say, but there remains a greater task, to find out the author of all this sorrow and to stamp him out. And since so, do we not see our duty? Yes, and do we not promise to go on to the bitter end?
So, by declaring that they must kill Dracula in the same way that Cohen declared that they must kill, cultural moments and sexual curiosities, by killing Dracula, the characters in the book are eliminating the social curiosities of the time, and since Dracula embodies the cultural moments of sexual, physical, and intellectual curiosities, by stamping him out, they are stamping those out as well. Finn.